to be here, Michelle.
So, Larry, would you tell us how you first got started in business journalism?
I'll tell you how I first got started in journalism, and then I'll kind of go to business journalism.
Sounds good.
I didn't know what I wanted to major in at college, and there was nothing I wanted to. I couldn't figure out what do I want to do the same day the rest of my life. That's what I thought back in kind of the 1970s, and I said there was nothing. But journalism appealed to me because you could do different things every day. Even if you're covering a beat, you're meeting different people, you're changing beats, and so you're covering one thing kind of one year and another thing the next year. And so a lot of appeal to me was just the variety that you get. And also, in the end, journalism was about people and getting people to talk to you and finding interesting stuff. And so that's what really attracted me to journalism in general. Now, as far as business journalism, I didn't know that I was going to be interested in business journalism, but I actually, was drawn by the drama of it. Maybe some people outside business don't think of it that way, but there are winners and losers. The stakes are really high. One of my first beats at the Wall Street Journal was retailing. Okay, so now this is back in the late 1970s, before most of you were born. And I covered, among other things, the emergence of Walmart and Target. Kind of Sears was the dominant player on the retail scene. And yet, Walmart came as a disruptor. And it just was fascinating to watch that happen. At another stage in my career, I ran the Boston bureau of the Wall Street Journal. Okay, and that was when it was Silicon Valley versus Route 128. Again, many of you probably haven't heard much about Route 128, I think because Silicon Valley surpassed it. And again, that was a kind of a great battle between these two tech centers. And so that was what really got me. And there was also the interesting personalities behind the companies. I mean, there are faces, and often the best companies are driven by people who have vision and really are, kind of that burning desire to succeed and innovate.
So you spent 25 years at the Wall Street Journal. What are some of your best memories of working there?
First of all, I'm sure there's similar to a lot of you at Google. When you work at a place like the Wall Street Journal, you're really working with the best in the business. And that's really cool, where you're constantly being challenged by the people around you. You're, learning from them, especially when you're young. That's really interesting. Kind of my most memorable time at the Wall Street Journal was actually kind of a little bit of a sad time. It was September 11th, 2001. So at that point, I was working in the office downtown. The office of the Wall Street Journal then was diagonal from the World Trade Center. And I was going to work the morning of September 11th and got off the subway downtown and noticed that there was some smoke coming from the top of one of the buildings. So I had been on when the first plane hit. I was making my way to the office, and I heard, kind of a jet screaming, and I thought maybe somebody's scrambling some jets. In fact, it was the second plane kind of slamming into the other tower. And that day is a blur, just kind of how we at the Wall Street Journal all, despite being knocked out of our offices, went to a satellite office and managed to put out, kind of a great coverage for the next day's paper, which actually won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage. Again, kind of extraordinarily memorable, sad, but kind of important.
Thank you for sharing that. What are some of the bigger lessons you learned from your experience of working at the Wall Street Journal?
So I would say, as a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, you have to be at the top of your game. If you're covering business, I think it's really important to take a critical eye, but also be fair. Kind of tough, but, always willing to listen. And especially for me, I think that business is one of the things that has made America great. It's not that business is perfect. There are a lot of things that, we need to delve into as journalists. And yet, the amount of innovation and creativity in this country is one of the things that means our economy has kept growing and succeeded others. So it's kind of important, kind of to really delve into things but delve into them with an open mind.
Yeah. Well, speaking of delving into things,
yes, right.
Share with us what prompted you to write Billion Dollar Brand Club.
Okay, so I assume everybody here knows about Dollar Shave Club. Maybe some of you are customers. Raise hands. Okay.
There's a few.
When did you first hear about Dollar Shave Club? Maybe 3 years ago, 5 years ago? Okay, so I heard about Dollar Shave Club in 2011, 8 years ago, before it actually was named Dollar Shave Club. So the founder I knew because he was a friend of my daughter's. He was an out-of-work digital marketing executive. Now remember, at one point I worked in the Boston bureau of the Wall Street Journal. I covered Gillette. Gillette is a formidable company. It makes a great product. It has great marketing. It was one of the early innovators as far as using sports marketing, spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It had a 70% market share, not just for a few years, but for decades. If you think about that, I mean, there are few companies more dominant in the industry than Gillette. And so I didn't say it to Michael, but when I heard he was going to start a company that was going to sell razors online and compete with Gillette, I thought, oh, really? You know, are you kidding me? You know, kind of, you know, you're going to be out of work again very soon. Flash forward 5 years later, I was driving to work. It was 7 a.m. I was listening to the radio, and I hear Unilever has bought Dollar Shave Club for $1 billion. And I'm going down the 10 and, you know, kind of I'm gripping the wheel and trying to kind of keep going, you know, kind of out of my lane. I was like, first thing I said out loud to myself, he did it. Michael, expletive deleted, did it.
Right.
Because I was so stunned. And the second thing I said to myself was, how did he do it? I said, how did that happen? So, you know, kind of there was that curiosity, just kind of an innate journalist curiosity. And I was getting toward the end of my newspaper career and wanted to write a book. And it occurred to me that, hey, by the way, it's not just Dollar Shave Club, but there are all these other brands that I don't know, they have kind of appeared out of nowhere. And one of the great things, if you're a journalist and you don't know the answer, that's good. If you know all the answers, maybe a lot of people know the answers. But it gave me, say, I'd like to learn about this and tell the story. And then, of course, I'd known about the video that went viral, but I didn't know all the backstory about it. But that also kind of gave me a chance to kind of really delve into that. So that video cost about $5,000 to make. And it has been viewed, the last time I looked, 26.6 million times on YouTube. You guys have heard of YouTube, right?
And I actually have a confession. I had never seen it until about 6 months ago. I go to business school, and they played it in one of our classes, and we were talking about this story, but you really brought it to life in your book.
Yeah. So I was interested, so I sat down with Michael Dubin, and I just wanted to get, you know, kind of the story behind that. And I'll read a little excerpt from my book about the making of the video. Dubin had little money for advertising, so he started thinking about making a video to post online. He wrote a script and called Lucia Agnello, a friend from improv acting classes in New York, who was now a director in Los Angeles. At 7:30 on a Saturday morning in October 2011, Dubin and a couple of friends he asked to play parts gathered in a warehouse on a drab industrial strip in Gardena, near Los Angeles International Airport, where the boxes of unsold blades were stored. They were finished by 4 p.m. that afternoon. The video, as with improv, seems informal when you're watching it, even casual, but that was all for effect. Every scene, every line had been written and rewritten to communicate a specific message: price, quality, convenience. And the video had to be irreverent and make viewers laugh so they would share it with friends. The script initially ran about 4 pages, but Agnello helped cut it in half. It actually runs like 1 minute and 31 or 33 seconds. They didn't want wasted words that might give viewers a reason to stop watching. One challenge, Dubin knew, was that potential customers would wonder about the quality of the blades. Every guy wants a cheap shave, but no one wants nicks and cuts all over his face. Rather than skirt the question, he decided to hit it head on with humor. So as you saw, the video starts with Dubin on camera introducing himself and the company. What is DollarShaveClub.com? Well, for $1 a month, we send high-quality razors right to your door. Yeah, $1. Next, just 15 seconds into the video, Dubin poses a question he knew viewers would be asking. Are the blades any good? No, he says, pausing briefly before delivering the punchline. Our blades are fucking great. All this is delivered deadpan with a straight face. The line was suggested by Agnello as they tried to come up with something that would grab the viewer. She later recalled to a reporter, "I remember Mike's face when I first said that line. There was a half a second of concern, and then whatever angel was sitting on his shoulder, or devil maybe, said, go for it." Dubin also takes pot shots at Gillette throughout the video, but as you'll note, never by name, to make sure no one misses the point of how expensive its products are. And of course, then there was the simple, memorable slogan at the end, shave time, shave money.
And there you have it. So how did you decide to structure the book, and how did you choose the companies to research?
So obviously, to me, the best stories, business stories or otherwise, revolve around the people behind the stories. Because in the end, that's what makes companies successful. And in doing it, there are a lot of companies out there. You all know many of them. But I didn't want to tell us, each chapter you could have said, okay, here's a chapter about Dollar Shave Club, and here's a chapter about Warby Parker, and here's a chapter about Hubble, and here's a chapter about Glossier, here's a chapter about Away, and yada, yada, yada. It would seem very much the same. It wouldn't feel like a book, like a narrative. And so the way that I decided to structure it was, because it fit the theme of the book, which is that technology had lowered the barriers of entry and leveled the playing field in ways that these brands could take on giants, which they couldn't have done a decade earlier, even. And so I wanted to look at the various aspects. So how did has technology lowered the playing field as far as production and outsourcing, marketing, data, kind of using data to sell, distribution, which is getting stuff to your home. So each chapter was very much kind of focused on a different aspect. And then I added a couple of chapters. And one of the things when you're doing a book that is kind of live, where it's evolving, I initially wasn't thinking of doing a chapter about retailing, physical retailing, because not that many of the brands at that point were doing physical retail. Warby Parker was, but very few. But the more I reported it, the more I realized that there were a lot of companies that were doing that. And so it was kind of why, if you started direct to consumer, did you decide to do that? And so I explained that. And ditto, I wasn't initially planning a chapter on logistics, but I just found it so fascinating. I mean, none of this would be possible without innovation in logistics, so that warehouses could get stuff to your door cheaply and quickly. And then was, okay, now I've got my themes, I've got to find the companies that fit the themes. I wanted to have a little bit of a mix of the best known companies, the pioneers, so Warby Parker. And oh, by the way, the chapter on Warby Parker was really about customer experience, because I think that is essential to the success of a lot of these companies. They're called direct-to-consumer brands. I also call them connect-to-consumer brands, because they make a very concerted effort to really have a connection with their customers. And one of those connections is kind of a great customer experience. As Neil Blumenthal told me, you know what? These things, and by the way, these are Warby Parker glasses, they're kind of commodities. We design our own frames, and we think our frames are cooler than anybody else's on the planet. But look, they're frames. So what is most important to a lot of people, we want to make it seamless. We want to make you feel you walk in and have a great experience. And oh, by the way, they had a price advantage. They started, their single vision frames started with lenses, started at $95, and you would go to any other existing optician, it would be $200, $300, $400. And then I stumbled across some companies. I knew some of the companies I wanted to do, but as I did some research, I stumbled across some that I didn't really know so much about. For example, I knew about Away because it had emerged as the leader in the luggage business, but I didn't know so much about Rayden and Blue Smart. These were other companies that had fallen by the wayside. And so I did a chapter where I kind of included them. And I think that was an important chapter because actually it said, you know what? They're going to be losers here as well as winners. All this stuff looks really easy, and there are billion-dollar brands, and I think that there are sustainable billion-dollar brands, but they're also going to be modest successes, they're going to be niche successes, and they're going to be losers. And I think that was really important to include in the book.
So you've mentioned a lot of great brands that we're all familiar with. Can you share with us any companies that you researched but their stories didn't make it in the book?
Well, I probably talked to 175, 200 people. Some of it were multiple people at one company, but also there were companies. In some cases, I went to a company and I was looking for, how do you market and how's that evolved? But there were a few companies that I was, kind of planning to cover in detail in the book. One of them was a company that I won't name, but it makes wool sneakers. And it was based in San Francisco. And I had a couple of conversations with them, and I found it really interesting. It's quite a successful company, innovative. And I went back to them and said, hey, look, these have been great conversations. Now, can you put me in touch with your suppliers? Can I talk to the people who design your product? I want to delve deeper. It is a book, I can't, with an hour interview, I can't, write a whole chapter or a better part of a chapter. And, they we're really busy. We're growing rapidly. We really don't have time. Sorry, we can't help you with that. So they are in the book, but more in passing. In the end, for a book like this, you have to, kind of work, especially if you're going to dig deep. You get multiple interviews. You can't do it with just one interview because it's not really credible. Even on that example, Radin, which is one of the luggage companies that went out of business, which appeared to have an early lead, I would say, kind of to his credit, the founder was helpful. He was more helpful after I talked to a half dozen, 8 people who had left the company and told me a lot of details. And so he needed to be able to respond to what they said. But yeah, there were companies, and with that shoe company, I understood, kind of they're busy. And I would rather have somebody be all in rather than, kind of be half in, because it doesn't really work when you're trying to write a book.
Sure. So you mentioned you conducted over 200 interviews. Were there specific characteristics across the companies that you spoke with that, in your opinion, may have contributed to their success or failure?
Okay, one is luck. Okay, Dollar Shave Club. Michael Dubin will tell you that kind of doing a video that has 26.6 million views. I mean, look. It was artfully done. It was skill, but also there was like the right time and the right place. So you have to say that there was luck. So that's a good question, Michelle, because I do think that there are some things in common. One is that these companies spotted a problem and a solution to that problem, spotted a need and a way to fill that need. So let's say kind of mattresses and the direct-to-consumer mattresses. Is there a more miserable experience than going to a mattress store and, the salesman is stalking you around the store and kind of steer you to the most expensive mattress in the store and then kind of encourage you to lie down on it for 30 to 60 seconds and like yuck, because how many people have been lying down on that mattress earlier in the day and the week. And then they sell it to you, say, okay, look, this feels great. And you kind of ship it to you at home, you get it home, and after 2 or 3 nights, your back is killing you. And you're like, oh, can I return it? And the salesman said, sure. There is a 20% restocking fee, kind of, oh, and by the way, kind of the return shipping, $100 or whatever, it's on you. And by that time you say, okay, I'll let my back suffer. So the genius behind, kind of that was, hey, I'm, the mattress companies, and it wasn't just one, but a bunch of them, is like, we'll ship it to you. You can, try it for 30 to 60 days. We're not going to have like 20 different varieties. We're going to have initially just had one. Now they generally have 3, different price points as they're growing. So finding a problem, it helped also if you were in a category that was dominated by a handful of people, companies that were also arrogant and complacent, because they were like, kind of, why should I have to worry about Dollar Shave Club, or why should I have to worry about Tuft & Needle or Casper? And interestingly, most of these companies were started by people who didn't know that much about the product they were going to sell. And you think that's would be a disadvantage. It turns out to be an advantage instead of a disadvantage in many of these categories. I mean, you have to learn at some point about it, but and that's because they could think outside the box in saying a different model, different way of doing business. So they weren't constrained by the corporate world and oh, it can't be done that way, or somebody thought about that 3 years ago and it didn't work. Well, maybe it didn't work because the technology wasn't there, or the consumers weren't, used to buying stuff online. There are all sorts of reasons things don't work. So I think those were some of the broad, kind of 10,000 feet lessons that I took away.
In your opinion, what role does Google play in the direct consumer brands you write about?
Good question. So, and it depends on the category. And, I've talked to people about this. So early on, Dollar Shave Club, Harry's. In 2012, how many people would actually search for Dollar Shave Club or Harry's? First of all, I'd never heard of it, so they wouldn't search for that. How many would search for a subscription, discount razor subscription? Again, it was such a new thing that very few people would hear it. So the driving force for them was social media marketing. That's where they put most of their effort. Things have changed a little bit, and I've talked to some marketers, and they said, look, now people do. Okay, so this is an important part because there you have, it is an intent platform. Okay, so if you're searching for that, there's probably is a pretty good chance that you're interested in buying that. Whereas in the past, the conversion rates were highest on Facebook. So that depends on the category. Now, I imagine somebody like Glossier probably doesn't do much, and I don't know for sure, but it probably doesn't do a lot on Google. It's still a big social media platform for them. But just this morning, I was having coffee with the marketing director for Eargo. Eargo is an inside-the-ear hearing aid that's a direct-to-consumer. And it's a very cool design product, and it's about half the price of hearing aids. He said something interesting, which is, yeah, we use social media to kind of create some brand awareness, but this is a product, even though it's half the price of a lot of existing products on the market, dominated by 5 players, which have 90% of the market, so they're not competing on price. They're trying to compete on features and keep their price high. Nobody is going to, unlike with, Glossier Boy Brow or Dollar Shave Club razors, nobody's going to click on a Facebook ad without it for Eargo hearing aids, $1,500. Their prices are like $1,500 to $2,500, and buy. They're going to do some research, and how do they do the research? They're going to go and kind of search and look at reviews. They're going to look at customer comments. They're going to do all those things. And so I think it depends on the category. The more expensive, the more complicated the category, the more likely it is. The more competitors you have in a category, so it is choice. People are going to turn to search, but this has evolved over time. So that early on, it wasn't that big. The big driver for Third Love Bra Company, the big driver was, and they, kind of Instagram and Facebook, and they still are, kind of heavily on that. But, somebody told me, our advertising was, kind of 4 or 5 years ago, it was 80 to 90% social media. Now it's 50 to 60%.
But to your point, the way consumers and brands interact is always changing, right? So
yes.
What changed during the making of the book?
So one of them I mentioned was, kind of retailing. So this presented a little bit of a conundrum for me. Okay, I'm writing a book about direct-to-consumer brands, and now some of them are actually kind of going to retail, and they're not doing kind of direct-to-consumer. So how do I, how is that rationalized? How does that fit? And there actually were some interesting reasons to do it. Now, for many of these companies, still, 50, 70, 80% of their sales are online. Okay, I think that Warby Parker probably has the biggest mix. They're closer to like 50-50. So it turns out this was happening for several reasons that were all coming together. One, it's, at some point you've reached many of the people that you can online who are actually going to buy a product online without seeing it or feeling it. There are certain people who are comfortable doing it, young people like you for the most part, but increasingly older people. And second, social media advertising was so effective in the early years. I did a panel discussion last week in New York with Simon Enever, and he's the founder of Quip toothbrush. Everybody's heard of Quip. And he said that early on, they started in 2015. And that was not the earliest. He said back then, for an average, for a $5 spend on Facebook, they would get a customer. And so they were selling him a $25 to $50 toothbrush, depending on you're getting the plastic or the metal one, and he's getting a revenue stream from the subscription for the toothbrush heads. That's amazing. He didn't say exactly how much he's spending now, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's significantly more. So anyway, as that got crowded, kind of people they had to start looking elsewhere, kind of different channels. And finally, depending on the category, product category, 80 to 90% of all retail is still done in physical stores. That's a big number. As Neil Blumenthal said, you got to go where the customers are. You can't ignore them. So, the evolution was, and I explained kind of why it's. And the final thing is that it turns out there's a lot of other stores closing. So opening a store is less expensive in a lot of markets. So you can get cheaper retail space. Some marketing professors have done a fair amount of research about, so what is the interaction for these new brands between, kind of when you open a physical store, does that cut into your online sales? Turns out it's the opposite. So Tuft & Needle, Warby Parker, Away, have all found that when they have a physical retail store, the digital sales in that demographic area actually go up too. And that's because people see it and it's like, oh, these people are for real, or I've been able to put my hands on the product. So that was one of the things that kind of, and then I decided to add a chapter about selling on Amazon. I mean, I didn't want the book to be about Amazon, so much has been written about Amazon. But a lot of these brands had a conundrum. Should I sell on Amazon? Should I not sell on Amazon? We don't want to because we're going to lose the data. We lose that direct connection with the consumer, which is so important to these brands, especially early on. So they're trying to figure it out. In some cases, like Tuft & Needle and Casper have introduced Amazon-only brands that sold only on that, so that you have to come for their other brands. But there are some companies that are trying to sell all their products only on Amazon. They say this is the biggest channel. If we can kind of scrape data from Amazon, and Amazon, kind of like Google, with a lot of, you want people coming, so you provide a lot of data to companies. We can create products. We can create a brand factory that will get people coming back. So there was this. It is constant evolution. That was kind of one of the final points that I maybe should have mentioned earlier about the successful companies. They're nimble. They're looking around the corner. They're not saying the way I'm doing it now is the way, and it's working now great for me, is the way that I'll keep doing it. They're actually saying, this may be, it may change a year or two from now, and I have to be considering how I have to change a year or two from now.
So you've talked a little bit about technology and how that's benefited businesses over the years and changed the face of the economy. Do you feel that there are any downsides to the rapid expansion of technology in business and in our daily lives? Surely,
with just about everything. Although I think that we need to be careful about, demonizing technology overall. So, how many of you have ever or how often do you kind of go to a bank teller? Yeah,
never.
Like almost never, right? Well, when I was growing up, that's how you got your money from the bank. If you want to do any transaction, you have to go. So now there are these things called ATM machines. I remember the early stories in business journalists writing about ATM machines and the proliferation. I remember the first time I used it, it was like, oh my God, I'm not really sure how this thing works. Nobody would want to go back to a time where you don't have ATM machines. And presumably it has put some bank tellers out of work, okay? But maybe those bank tellers are doing something a lot more productive. So, to me, technology is really important when it can improve productivity. Improve productivity, makes companies more successful. More successful, they're hiring more people, kind of in the end, or they're figuring out new jobs for more people. Now, obviously, there are trickier questions, which we all know about, kind of the gathering of data and the use of that data. And I think a lot of these DTC companies, as I've mentioned, depend on using that data to have a direct relationship with the customers. I think they have to be very careful about, kind of how they use the data, and they have to protect the privacy of the data. And, and then of course there's a problem with, even if you're doing everything you can and you get hacked, that's an issue. So a lot of this I think has to be, there does need to be government oversight and government regulation, because I think that there are risks. But I don't think we should get into in a world where we don't want technology to be used to drive improvements in productivity, because often that leads in improvements to the way we live. A final example, and this has nothing to do with DTC, but the self-driving car, right? Every time that a Tesla car, kind of gets involved in a crash where somebody's injured or it's a fatality, there's like a big about it, and there need to be attention about it. But the number of people who actually killed in car accidents every day because of human error, where kind of there wasn't an autopilot system to stop the car before an accident, is infinitesimally higher. And so we shouldn't accept that while saying that this advance in technology for self-driving kind of in a much lower rate kind of causes accidents. It's nonsensical.
Is there a particular industry or even a category that you think might be ripe for disruption?
Yeah, people ask me. First of all, there's so many of these categories have gotten crowded. The mattress business, in fact, I kind of, the chapter is called The Mattress Wars because it was so easy to create a mattress company that you had dozens of them. I think there'll probably be a half dozen winners in the end. There are. I mentioned my book, there are a half dozen electric toothbrush companies, and Simon Henneberg kind of not corrected me. He said there are more than a dozen copycats that are kind of doing. So it gets a little bit more difficult. And again, once the problem has been solved and somebody is fixing it, it makes it harder. So you have to look for another problem. So healthcare is one of the things that I'm curious about. In the chapter I have on Eargo hearing aids, it raises the question about what is the limits of DTC. Can you sell medical, kind of medical devices or things that have medical care? Smile Direct Club has proven that it's quite successful. It's a teeth aligner instead of braces. They're much less expensive. That company went public. The stock went public at a very high price. The stock fell. Okay, so instead of being worth $7 billion when it was sold, maybe it got down to $3 billion. But I also think and it has 500,000 customers, or I forget what the number is. Somebody created this company that was still $3 billion that didn't exist 5 years ago. That's kind of a success. So I think that medical products may be an area that is ripe for disruption. And there was a question I had from the other night when I was in New York. There was a woman probably in her 60s. She says, look, a lot of these products are for younger people. Kind of what about, kind of the products for older people? I hadn't thought about that. That's because most of the starting founders of the company are younger. And if I were an entrepreneur, I would try to think of, what are the solutions to problems that haven't been solved? And maybe they involve older consumers. And I'm one of those, but I can't think of one right now.
What do you hope the reader will take away from Billion Dollar Brand Club?
It's, risk takers are really important to our economy. They can innovate. They can innovate with product. They can innovate with process. They can innovate with ideas. A lot of these categories have been dominated by a handful of players, and that is not good. So competition, choice is good. It also forces existing players to think about the way they do things and change things. So in 2017, Gillette, after losing about 15% market share in 4 or 5 years, unbelievable, it lowered its prices for the first time in memory. So that is kind of good for consumers. I think so everything that's going on is good. And the other thing is just in general, I mean, you guys are at a big startup. Kid yourself as a startup anyway. But a lot of the lessons for entrepreneurs actually can be helpful for all of us in our everyday lives. If you think of what makes them successful, see a problem, solve a problem. In your everyday life at work, if you help your boss solve a problem, you're more likely to get raises or get promotions. In your everyday life, kind of with your friends and your spouse, if you try to anticipate problems. And kind of a final thing going back to, don't be complacent. And you guys in the tech industry really understand that. I think, you have always tried to look around the corner at Google. I think Amazon has done that, creating kind of new business opportunities. Tech companies that haven't done that have really suffered because something new is going to come along, and you have to get out ahead of that.
What is your favorite startup company that you've come across so far?
So I would kind of name three quickly. I mean, Dollar Shave Club, because of the sheer audacity and the amount of success as far as winning market share, is like totally impressive. It's just kind of hard to believe what they managed to do against this behemoth. Warby Parker, started by 4 graduate students. They did it. It was a class project because they really weren't sure if the idea was that good, and they figured that kind of if it didn't come to anything, at least they get class credit. The other cool thing about that, Wharton Business School, where they started this idea, has a competition every year for the best business ideas, and they didn't make it into the final 8 best business ideas. So there's kind of the idea of perseverance. If you really believe in it, you should keep at it. And then Third Love, the bra company, which had a couple of near-death experiences, as I describe in the book. And one of them was over manufacturing. The first manufacturer they went to, they had quality production problems, and that almost put them out of business until they got that right. Switching suppliers, and then kind of on marketing, they were kind of even after they got the production right, the marketing was slow, and they figured out how to solve that by a free home trial. Kind of was a big risk. Send it to you. You pay like $1 for the shipping or whatever it was, and try it for 30 days. If you don't like it, send it back. And a used bra you can't do anything with. It's not like kind of frames, glasses, and everything. So for each different reasons. I mean, there are so many I'm fascinated, but those I kind of picked those because they're different reasons.
Hi there. I'm on the marketing team here at Google, and we spend a lot of time telling our product stories through customers. I specifically work in the retail vertical. So do you have any tips and tricks for getting good stories out of people you're interviewing, and or things to look for when finding good stories to tell?
So the best stories often are come from kind of have a bit of conflict or tension or drama. It's not kind of the most obvious, like, yes, I was a happy customer for the very beginning and you were great and everything, but kind of I had this problem and kind of you solved it for me and you figured it out. So the chapter on Warby Parker is a lot on customer experience, like I mentioned that kind of. And so I just went online and did some searching for people who had good things to say about Warby Parker. And I find a guy, he didn't have a lot of detail. He says, look, I had a problem with them and they kind of fixed it right away and all that. And so I sent him a message and he responded. And it turned out it was like the night before Thanksgiving, and there was a scratch on his lens, and he'd only had the lens, the frames for a month, and he called them up, and Warby Parker, if you call them up, you have a problem. It's like within 6 seconds is their goal to answer the phone. Kind of it's pretty amazing, and then he said. He was expecting, first of all, I wasn't expecting to get an answer that quickly. He got an email back, and then somebody called him up, and then it was like, okay, just send it back. We'll send you a new pair. We'll get you them kind of early next week. He said, we didn't even expecting to hear from them until next week. So this made a good example to have in the book because there was, he was a little bit worried about it. He was a little bit upset. And yet they fixed it. So the internet is actually a good place to find those customer stories. Another one example was, so Glossier has a real kind of strong, they have a great community of followers, people. And so they constantly watch, all the different feeds. And there was a woman, an African-American woman in Atlanta who had started a Twitter account. It was Glossier Brown. And she posted something that said, I love the products, but, for, kind of certain kind of makeup, they don't have shades for, kind of darker skinned African-American women. Mm-hmm. Next thing she knows, she hears from the Glossier team. Oh, would you like to come up here and talk about it? Because we actually kind of saw your thing and kind of maybe we can, and sure enough, she goes up there, she explains what the issue was and within, kind of 3 to 6 months or whatever it took to formulate it, they had added shades again. So I just found that by kind of going online and looking for it. And so a lot of the best stuff to find kind of customers and figure out, kind of both complaints and kind of people who are happy is to go there. But also, look for, something that, kind of instead of I just loved it from the get-go, it's like there's something there that there's an added interest that makes for a story.
Great. I'll try Googling it.
Cool. Hi there. So I noticed a lot of these companies have hardware subscription or like hardware service models. Do you see that concept growing, and why or why not?
So, I mean, it's interesting what's going to happen. And some people ask me, is there a bubble? Well, first of all, when categories get crowded, that's a real issue. You're not going to have, 5 winners or 5 big winners in a category. Although I do think, and this is one of the, I think, kind of good things about this movement and the barriers to entry falling and how cheap it is to launch. It can be expensive to scale, as we talked, and why you had to start spending more in other areas. But to launch. So, eyeglasses. A couple of niche companies in the eyeglass business. How many of you have bought a pair of frames, and they were kind of an expensive pair because you thought they were really cool, and maybe they're designer frames, and then a year later you need a new prescription, and you go to the, your optician and say, hey, can you put new lenses in my frames? And they look at you like you're crazy. No, we want to sell you kind of another $200 or $300 frames. There's a company called Lensable that was created so that if you have a frame that you wanted your new lenses, you send them the frame, you send them the prescription, and they send it back to you. So you're just paying for the lenses. There's another one that kind of has started and just does like a certain type of lens for if you spend a lot of time in a computer, kind of a blue light. So I think that there are a lot of, is that going to be a $1 billion brand? I think that would be very hard, but there are going to be a lot of opportunities. And I think there has been this democratization. It will lead to fragmentation. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that can be a good thing. I don't think there's going to be a brand that has 70%. But getting back, there will be some losers. Some of the companies have taken too much venture capital money and they feel obligated to try to kind of go for a land grab. And if they're not really disciplined, and Casper recently came out with some figures where it showed that it was losing a lot of money and it's growing a lot. Well, there are a couple of other competitors in that field that are doing quite well. Tuft & Needle, which actually got sold to Serta Simmons, was profitable from the start. It got sold for $500 million, I was told. It was profitable from the start because it was bootstrapped. Purple Innovation, which is another mattress company doing quite well, is a public company, and so it is now profitable. But I think making that transition from customer acquisition and having money to then being profitable is going to be the test for a lot of these companies. And we're kind of getting to that point because you always get in cycles, right? You're getting to that point where some venture capitalists will say, okay, we've given you enough, now you have to prove it. And so we'll see in the next year or two how many of these brands will really kind of stay and keep growing and how many will fall by the wayside.
On that note, not a lot of these companies have been able to go public.
Right.
They've been bought or they've been absorbed in.
Yes.
So at the risk of sounding like a naysayer, what should we read into that? Does that mean that this is a very temporary spurt of innovation that doesn't have a long, I don't see any of these guys building a company like Google that's going to become a standalone super duper company that's going to have legs for 25 years.
Right.
So just what are your thoughts having dug into that?
Yeah. So, Google is an exceptional company. Okay, I think that there will be some brands that will be around for a long time. I don't know that they're going to be. How much are you guys worth? 10 million.
You're off by orders of factors of magnitude.
Yes, a trillion. I know. But I think Warby Parker will be a sustainable brand. Is it going to, and I think it could be $1 billion brand. I think they are thinking of doing an IPO, which tells me they're probably reasonably close to break even. And a number of companies have been acquired. I think, for example, probably Tuft & Needle could have gone public if it wanted to. It just got a good price and didn't have to worry about all those other issues. But that's on point. I think time is going to tell. I do think that there will be some sustainable brands. I don't think that, again, they're never going to be as big as a lot of the existing brands because the good thing about this movement is it's so easy to introduce brands now that you're going to have a lot of brands out there. And venture capitalists are just going to have to be a little bit more cautious with their money.
Hi, I'm curious, particularly for entrepreneurs who don't know that much about the products they want to sell, how do they find quality?
it can take a little bit of time. It takes a little bit of research, but you can, you can go find people who advise you on this, who are experts in an area. For example, there's a guy I don't mention him in the book, but I talked to him briefly because I didn't include watches in the end of the book, but he advises people who want to start watch companies on who the best manufacturers in China are for making watches. There's I mentioned there's a service called online called Penjiva. It basically tells you kind of who all the manufacturers are in China and general racing. Even Alibaba. A lot of people know Alibaba, but Alibaba has a buying service where it kind of gives gold stars to the suppliers that most buyers have been happy with, that are kind of ranked. So there are a lot of different ways to do that. And it probably, as with anything, is best to triangulate with those different ways. It's different things for different products. So it turns out with razor blades, they're only about a half dozen. I mean, razor blades are actually a pretty sophisticated thing to make it really sharp and to make it so it doesn't get dull too fast, and to be able to kind of high-speed manufacture those, kind of 5, kind of blade cartridges is hard. So if you want to do that, you go to one of those people, right? And you're pretty assured that you're going to be a pretty big product. Other products can vary, but it's a matter of research and bringing on your team people who are experts in that. Kind of one of the big secrets of most startups, especially in the consumer products, is, okay, I'm going to get an expert in marketing, I'm going to get an expert in production, I'm going to get an expert in distribution. Logistics are going to help me.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.